we heard like popping, and we didn't know what it was, and then I looked out the window, and there's this guy throwing like a pipe bomb at all the cars, and then he came in, they like started blowing up and shooting everyone in the cafeteria, and then you could hear him.
Sometimes violence strikes where we least expect it. This was the case in April 1999 in Littleton, Colorado, when 2 students launched an assault on Columbine High School, killing 13 and injuring 23 before turning their guns on themselves. How could anyone do such a thing? What factors may have played a role in motivating these 2 teenagers to such violence? How do psychologists find meaningful and reliable answers to questions like these about human behavior? The nation was shocked when 2 troubled teenagers turned their guns on fellow students and teachers at Columbine High School. In the days that followed, there were many theories offered as to their motivations. Most likely, there were many contributing factors. One of the most frequently mentioned is the time these teenagers spent playing violent video games. Many people made the leap that video games caused the violence. But how valid was this conclusion? Can video games really lead to aggression? These are the questions psychologists Craig Anderson and Karen Dill sought to answer in their 2-part study on video games and aggressive thoughts, feelings, and behavior in the laboratory and in life. As scientists, they wanted answers beyond conjecture and opinion. They sought verifiable evidence of whether a relation existed, the kind of evidence that is only available through scientific research.
The scientific method should really be thought of as a way of thinking about problems. It's a perspective, a way to approach generating information about how the world works. Research methodology is extremely important for psychologists to understand in exploring human behavior, because the methods can lead you in a particular direction in understanding of the human experience, human responses.
Psychologists who conduct scientific research are very particular about the evidence they consider and the manner in which they draw their conclusions. They are only interested in information that is scientifically valid.
Scientifically valid information can be distinguished from other kinds of information. There are other ways of knowing about how the world works and about the human experience. We can know through our intuition. It feels right. And we can know through religious, ideological, philosophical systems that provide us with an explanation for things that happen in our life. We can know because we believe the words of a respected authority. We can also know by a process of rationalism. We can think through issues and draw conclusions about the way the world works. But scientifically valid or empirical evidence or information is very different from any of those, in that it requires external proof. It requires the actual observation of relationships. And that's very different. It can be verified by anyone who would follow the procedures that are laid out in much detail by the scientists.
Researchers gather empirical evidence in several different ways, but they have one thing in common: a 4-step process known as the scientific method.
The first stage of the scientific method is problem definition, extremely important stage that results from a lot of critical thinking, review of previous studies that have gone on, theories that might be relevant to the relationships of interest. Often at this stage, one formulates hypotheses, very formal, concrete definitions of the relationships of interest and what kind of results, relationships you expect.
A hypothesis is a statement about a relation between 2 or more variables that researchers like Dill and Anderson want to test.
In study 1, we had one main hypothesis, and that was that people who played violent video games in their real lives would be more aggressive in their real lives as well. In study 2, we had 3 main hypotheses, and the first hypothesis was that people who played a violent video game in the laboratory would have more aggressive behavior shown in the laboratory, and the second and the third hypotheses follow straight from that. The second hypothesis is that the people who played the violent video game would have more aggressive thoughts, and the third is that the people who played the violent video game would also have more aggressive feelings.
The second stage is selecting, designing, and conducting procedures that will address, hopefully in an appropriate way, the questions of interest. At this stage, there are many decisions to be made. How many participants do you need in a study? How should the actual study be conducted? Who are the interesting populations? What measurements should be taken?
We brought in a number of college students and randomly assigned half of them to play a violent video game, randomly assigned the other half to play a nonviolent video game, and then later put them in a situation in which they were given an opportunity to aggress against someone who had provoked them. In reality, of course, laboratory situations, they're not actually aggressing against someone, but they believe that they were. The aggression took the form of delivering loud noise bursts to the other person in the context of a competitive task. How loud they set those bursts was a measure of aggressive behavior.
The third stage of the scientific method involves organizing, summarizing, and analyzing the information or data that are derived from the study. So at this stage, the researcher, scientist, selects quantitative techniques most often to try and see if the information generated from the study, whether the information supports the hypotheses or refutes the hypotheses.
We then can compare those two groups, those who had just played a violent game versus those who had just played a nonviolent game, to see if, in fact, one game or the other led to, on average, higher punishment settings or noise blast settings for their opponent.
And then finally, at the fourth stage, and very much a very important part of science, is to report the results to other scientists, to broader populations who may be interested in the variables or relationships of interest. And at this stage, it's not the end of the research process by far. One gets feedback from other scientists about the results of studies. Scientific research can be thought of as tentative, some of the conclusions from a study. And one of the central characteristics of scientific research, scientific inquiry, is the fact that studies' results have to be verifiable by others.
Using the scientific method, where does one begin to get answers to questions like those posed by Columbine? How can researchers determine the actual effects of video games on the people who play them? There are 3 main methodologies: descriptive, correlational, and experimental. They vary in the type of information they give us. Descriptive research describes a phenomenon. A simple example would be if a researcher obtained the sales figures for the various video games. This would be empirical evidence about the number of these games in the population. If the researcher wanted more data about video game purchasers, he might do a survey asking about age, sex, educational level, and income, which would yield more detailed empirical evidence. Or the researcher might do a case study, which would present a detailed picture of one particular person's video game usage. Another type of descriptive research is naturalistic observation.
Naturalistic observation is the process by which a researcher goes out into real-world contexts and observes people behaving in ways that they normally behave. Typically, these people don't know that they're being observed. For instance, I might go out to a video arcade and just kind of wander around and watch people playing different kinds of video games. If I want to take notes and don't want to, in some sense, be obtrusive, I might periodically leave the arcade, make a few notes, and then come back.
Darwin's work that led to the theory of the origin of species was primarily based on naturalistic observations. A lot of what we know about chimpanzees, for example, came from Jane Goodall's work in natural settings by observing chimpanzees in social groups. And through her descriptive research, we found out that chimpanzees actually displayed violent behaviors towards other groups of chimpanzees, something that had never been thought about before she described this in detail through observation.
The main pros of descriptive methodologies involve the fact that it's very natural. You're going to the place where the behavior is happening and you're watching it happen, and you're trying not to interfere with it. So therefore, you should get people's natural reactions and you should reduce artificiality. And that's a big plus a lot of times. You want to see behaviors that you might be afraid won't happen in the laboratory.
That can lead to some real insights, the generation of some good hypotheses about what is this phenomenon about.
Some of the limitations of descriptive methodologies include the fact that causal relationships, causal inference is not possible. So the why questions are not able to be answered.
For example, let's say you watch children playing in an arcade and there's also a lot of noise going on. That noise might be causing some of the variables you're interested in studying, but you don't know that because you're not interfering, you're not trying to control the noise. So control of the environment is a big con for descriptive studies.
Descriptive studies provide useful information, but they do not answer the question of whether there is a relation between two variables, such as video game playing and aggression. For that, researchers turn to correlational studies.
A correlation shows a relationship between two variables, and it is two and only two variables. And what we can know is the nature of the relationship between those two variables. For example, a positive correlation means that the two variables' values will rise and fall together, and a negative correlation is kind of like a seesaw, whereas one variable goes up, the other one goes down.
A simple example of correlation, one that everyone's very familiar with, is that height and weight tend to be positively correlated. As taller people tend to weigh more than shorter people.
One negative correlation from my field of research, which is media violence, looks at kids and how much TV they watch, and they found that there's a negative correlation between the amount of TV a young child watches and the number of vocabulary words they know when they enter school. So that if you spend a lot of time watching TV, you actually know fewer words.
Correlational studies can be very useful in understanding human behavior and the human experience. They can identify consistent patterns of associations between variables.
A correlation allows you to predict from one variable with some degree of accuracy what a person's score would be on another variable.
In their first study, Anderson and Dill looked for correlations to tell them if there is a link between real-life video game playing and real-life aggression.
The design of Study 1 had students come in and complete a survey in which they named their 5 favorite video games and rated those games on the amount of aggressive content.
We then asked them to indicate how often they've played each of those games. Very frequently, not at all, just occasionally, things like that. We created an index that indicates the extent to which each person is exposed to violent video game content.
Then they reported their amount of aggressive behavior that they had engaged in the past year.
We created a measure of what we call trait aggression. It's actually based on 2 different scales. These are self-report questionnaires that ask people to respond to items like, when someone hurts me, I try to hurt them back. And then the respondent has to indicate whether they agree or disagree with that statement. From a series of those statements or items, then we create a score for each person indicating to what extent they tend to score high or low on trait aggressiveness.
And then we correlated the 2 variables. The results did show the predicted correlation that the more time a person spent playing violent video games in their real life, the more aggressive behaviors they had engaged in the past year.
We were also looking at the correlation between time spent playing any kind of video game and aggressive behavior, in part because we wanted to see if it was the violent content per se that was important or whether it was simply kids who play a lot of video games don't learn social skills and therefore grow up to become more aggressive people. And in fact, we found exactly what we expected. You get a big correlation between exposure to violent video games and aggression, and a much smaller correlation between playing any kind of video games and aggression.
One always has to be cautious in interpreting the results of correlational studies. Correlations are only measures of association. No matter how strongly two variables are associated, this does not mean that we can therefore infer that there is a cause and effect relationship. For example, there are very reliable and consistent associations found between depression and physical health, but from correlational studies alone, one cannot conclude that depression leads to a deterioration in physical health, or if being in a compromised physical condition leads to depression.
Anderson's and Dill's correlational study established that there is a relation between video game playing and aggression, but it does not indicate whether video games cause aggression. When scientists want to establish a cause and effect relation, they use the experimental method.
The experimental method is one of the most powerful tools for psychologists to identify what are the causes of particular outcomes and effects. It's a very powerful methodology in that it allows for very strong inferences to be drawn about cause and effect. It allows the researcher to have a great deal of control over the events occurring during a study. All experiments consist of three characteristics, central characteristics, and these are the deliberate manipulation of one or more independent variables, the inclusion of at least one control or comparison group, and third, all experimental studies can be characterized by random assignment.
The way the experimental method establishes cause and effect is to isolate two variables, say the amount of sun exposure and the severity of a sunburn, to determine if a change in the first, the independent variable, affects a change in the second, the dependent variable. If it does, it infers a cause and effect relation.
Independent variables are those that are the presumed causes of outcomes. They're the antecedent variables, the variables that might contribute to outcomes and consequences. Dependent variables, on the other hand, are measured and assumed to be the effects. They are the variables through which the effects of the independent variables will be manifested.
In the experimental study, the main independent variable, again, was violent video game play. What we did was we had two separate video games. One was very violent in nature and graphic, and the other was non-violent in nature. So those were the two levels of the independent variable. The dependent variables were aggressive behavior, aggressive thoughts, and aggressive emotions.
The independent variable in the experimental study was expected to be related to the dependent variable in the following way. We expected those who had been randomly assigned to play the violent game would later on behave more aggressively than those who had been assigned to play the nonviolent game.
In order to find out if the independent variable causes a change in a dependent variable, scientists established two different groups of subjects. In the first, the experimental group, they manipulate the independent variable to see what effect it has on the dependent variable. In the second group, the control group, there is no such manipulation.
The reason we use a control group is because always when you have an independent variable, you have to have at least two groups within that independent variable. For example, the experimental group and the control group. Let's say, for example, I was studying violent video game effects, and all I did was take some students, have them play a violent video game, and then measure their aggression. Well, then I would say, hey, these students had a certain level of aggression, but the question would be, are they aggressive or not? Compared to what? And so I have to have something to compare them to. And the role of the control group is to act like a baseline.
And for that reason, we want the control group to be essentially the same as the experimental group in all features, as many as possible, with the exception of the independent variable, as we want them to be the same kind of people, We want them to be treated the same way by the experimenters. We want them to play a game that is as equally enjoyable or frustrating. We simply want the groups to differ on one thing, and that one thing in this case is, does the game contain violent content or not?
One way the researchers achieve this sameness between groups is through random assignment of the subjects.
In order to show cause and effect relationships, one needs to assume that the groups in a study, the participants in a study, initially began as equal or nearly equivalent. The best way to ensure that is to use some kind of a scheme where individuals who have agreed to participate in the study are assigned to an experimental or control group based on chance. In this way, the characteristics of individuals that differ naturally in the world, that these characteristics could somehow be evened out across experimental and control groups initially.
What we do is randomly assign participants to either the control group or the experimental group, and random assignment means that each student had an equal chance of being in one of those two groups.
Random assignment is essential to valid results. For instance, if Anderson and Dill had allowed the players to pick which game to play instead of assigning them to games, the more aggressive players might have chosen the more aggressive game. It would have been impossible to determine if any later aggressive behavior was due to the game or to just their personality. Likewise, it's important to ensure that other variables cannot have caused the results.
The control group differed from the experimental group only in the content of the game that they played. In all other respects, they were treated the same. They were the same kinds of people. We had males and females in both groups. We had high and low trait aggressive people in both groups. The way that the experimenter treated them in terms of instructions, how long they played the game, all those sorts of things were essentially identical.
We try to make the environment for those participants as similar as possible, except for the independent variable of video game violence. So the students came into the same laboratory. It was the same room, same temperature, same surroundings. They sat in the same sized cubicle. They had the same experimenter. And time of day was a random factor such that students came all during the day at different times, and that was not tied to whether they were in the experimental or the control group.
Furthermore, the two games themselves were selected to be similar in a lot of ways. Both are called first-person games. They were equated in terms of how much our participant population enjoyed playing them on average. They were equated in terms of how much physiological arousal they induce in people when they play them. So that the two conditions really differed primarily in terms of that violent content, that is, the independent variable itself.
Once the subjects had played the game, the researchers next measured their aggressiveness.
We used a standard laboratory measure of aggressive behavior. It's called the competitive reaction time task. It's been used, or various versions of it, have been used for well over 35 years now. In this task, the participant believes that they're competing against another person who's in another room, sitting at another computer, on a series of reaction time trials. They put headphones on, they hear a tone, they click a mouse button. Whoever responds slowest is punished by a blast of noise, we call it white noise, static essentially, over the headphones. Now, in reality, there is no other person. It's all computer controlled.
We analyzed the data using a statistical technique called analysis of variance, and what that looks at is it tries to find group differences. So in our case, was there a difference in the amount of aggressive behavior between those who had played the violent video game and those who had played the non-violent video game? And our analysis of variance confirmed that this was the case. The results of the study indicated confirmation of our first two hypotheses, but not the last one. In other words, we found that playing violent video games in the laboratory caused increases in aggressive behavior and aggressive thoughts, but not for our third hypothesis, which was increases in aggressive emotions.
This study also showed that this short-term exposure to violent video game increases aggressive thoughts, one of our other dependent variables. And that was pretty much as expected by the theory. We also found that people who score high on measures of trait aggression do, in fact, behave more aggressively than those who score low.
The two designs really complement each other. The correlational design can't tell us any information about cause and effect, but it shows us behavior that happens in real life, so that we know that those people who choose to play violent video games have more aggressive behavior in their real lives. Now, we don't know what causes what in that setting, but the second study is a true experiment, and that gives us the opportunity to make statements about cause and effect. We can say that it was the video game that caused the changes in aggressive behavior. So taken together, this adds some information to what is now a very small literature on video game violence effects, and it suggests definitely that we need to do future research to investigate this further.
Such investigation is the cornerstone of psychology. Each new study not only gives us more information about why human beings behave as they do, it generates questions for even further study. Taken together, they build a body of knowledge about human behavior. Anderson and Dill's single study cannot tell us to what extent video games are responsible for what happened at Columbine High School that tragic spring day. But it has pointed psychologists in a promising direction that someday may pay off in a more complete picture of the human experience. Witnesses said 2 or more